The country legend with an evil habit, the hippie icon who destroyed his family, the composer who thought he was a god. Musicians are some of the most beloved artists on the planet, but even the brightest stars can turn out to have a dark side. A lot of messed up stuff happened during Johnny Cash's life, but it's worth discussing just how horrible he was to women. Vivian Cash's book, I Walked the Line, was a heartbreaking tell-all detailing how she continued loving her husband, even through his addictions and his affair with his more famous second partner, June Carter Cash. It was Vivian who gave him 4 daughters, raised them, and stuck with him through his worst times, but Cash always gave all the credit to June. Behind closed doors, June Carter didn't actually have it any easier, despite the storybook romance performed for the public. Indeed, Cash is even alleged to have cheated on her when she was pregnant with their son, John Carter. There were actually many women, but the most painful of all was probably June's own sister, Anita. John Carter has also discussed his parents' less-than-perfect marriage at length, and has claimed his mother's drug addictions and descent into paranoia came from a near-constant fear Johnny was cheating again. That fear spread to their son, who grew up well aware that his own family could fall apart at any time. Chuck Berry was a legend who helped shape the world of rock and roll, and when he died in 2017, The New Yorker described him as a proud and difficult man and a genius. He also once punched Keith Richards in the mouth for touching his guitar while they were getting together to organize Berry's 60th birthday party.
He walked in and goes, "Nobody touches my guitar." Boom! That's one of Chuck's biggest hits, babe.
And that's exactly the attitude that got him into all kinds of trouble. Berry even had a name for those incidents, his naughties. It all started when, as a teenager, Berry did 3 years in a reform school for car theft and armed robbery. Fast forward to 1962, when a 36-year-old Berry was jailed for violating the Mann Act, a law that prohibits taking a woman across state lines with so-called immoral intentions. The girl in question was 14 at the time. Berry served just 20 months of his 3-year sentence, getting out on appeal after his judge made a series of racist comments towards him. And things didn't get much better from there. In December 1989, Berry was accused of videotaping women in the bathroom of one of his restaurants. The following June, his property was raided, with law enforcement finding weapons, cannabis, and the videotapes in question, placing him at the center of a class action lawsuit. Berry's camp eventually settled. It's impossible to overestimate the effect Elvis has had on music history. The King was just 21 when he became ridiculously famous with the success of Heartbreak Hotel. And after that, all bets were off when it came to how far he was going to go. Along with the fame and fortune came the admiration of countless women, but there was one particular type of woman Elvis liked, the really, really young ones. In fact, the right age to be an Elvis girl was 14, and according to Elvis Presley, A Southern Life, when the 22-year-old megastar went on those early tours, he took along a whole group of 14-year-olds. He was a huge fan of tickling and wrestling the girls, along with everything else, short of actual intercourse. Elvis's future wife Priscilla was 14 when she met the 24-year-old star, and just what went on behind closed doors has been widely debated. After their daughter was born, however, he lost interest in her, instead courting another 14-year-old girl. There was violence in Elvis's relationships too. Years later, he was engaged to Ginger Alden, a 21-year-old who later claimed he once pulled a gun out and put a bullet in the headboard of the bed she was sleeping in. In between these significant relationships, there was a number of others too, many of them involving underage girls. Frank Sinatra was one of the all-time greats on the stage, but there was a lot of shady stuff that took place off it. For example, his temper. It was reportedly so bad that one of his wives described him as a sort of Jekyll and Hyde character. Suitably, he was involved in a long list of physical altercations during his life. For example, he punched a reporter in 1948, eventually settling the assault and battery charges filed against him. Another time, Sinatra was staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel when he threw a phone at a random businessman who was also present and cracked the man's skull. He also nearly killed his then-wife Ava Gardner by throwing a champagne bottle at her so hard it cracked the bathroom sink. Sinatra also had a destructive edge. He once took a knife to a Norman Rockwell painting and shredded it, threw a malfunctioning TV out of a window at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, and smashed the car radio when he heard it play Light My Fire by the Doors. Perhaps most impressively of all, he once destroyed a Ming vase at a Hong Kong hotel after someone missed a lighting cue. Jerry Lee Lewis changed the face of rock and roll. He helped shape decades worth of music, and he has a very dark side indeed. The Guardian interviewed him in 2015 and said it's almost impossible to figure out what's true and what's legend, including the circumstances around his nickname, the Killer. The story Lewis tells is that a friend just called him that one day for no discernible reason, but it's also possible it came after he tried to strangle and kill one of his teachers, an act he fully admits to having committed. Lewis has also had 7 wives, and 2 died mysteriously, one by drowning and one by overdose. The latter incident went to court, where Lewis was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing. But the law was not on his side after he shot his bass player in the chest and had to pay out $125,000. Lewis's most infamous marriage was that of his own cousin's daughter, Myra, who was just 13 years old when they were married. You can't get much bigger than the Metropolitan Opera, and for more than 40 years, conductor James Levine was at the very top of it. He sported such titles as Director Emeritus and worked with the company's Young Artist program as Artistic Director. In 2018, however, it was announced that the Met was officially ending its association with Levine amid accusations of sexual abuse and harassing conduct. Not a lot of details were released at the time. The Met's investigation involved interviews with 70 people and ended with an official statement saying the investigation also uncovered credible evidence that Mr. Levine engaged in sexually abusive and harassing conduct towards vulnerable artists in the early stages of their careers, over whom Mr. Levine had authority.
Well, he's like, we have to improve your bow arm, or we have to improve your sense of rhythm, and I can't understand you musically unless I understand you sexually.
Levine didn't comment on his firing at the time, which came after a December 2017 suspension prompted by 4 men who came forward to say that they had been targeted by the conductor as teenagers. Levine denied the accusations then, but it soon became clear that rumors of his abuses stretched back as far as the 1960s, when Levine was working at Oakland University's Meadowbrook School of Music. After these accusations became known to the general public, one of his accusers was quoted as saying, "The truth can be very useful. The truth creates good." Cee Lo Green hit something of a career rough patch in 2012 and 2013. His troubles began when he was accused of both giving a woman ecstasy and later raping her. Green ultimately pled no contest to the drug felony and got 3 years of probation, along with 45 days of community service. The rape charges simply went away because Green's lawyer argued that there was no proof it wasn't consensual. Green subsequently took to Twitter to voice his opinions on sexual assault. He wrote, "If someone is passed out, they're not even with you consciously, so with implies consent." The public reaction was swift and predictable, leading Green to quickly delete his tweets. Green later apologized, saying he'd never condone the harm of any women. Nevertheless, he has since become a poster child for the horrifying nature of the modern rape culture. If ever there was a human being who embodied the spirit of music, it would be Miles Davis. The jazz icon was one of the true greats of his genre, but he also carried with him a seriously troubled reputation. Davis's issues range from weird to horrifying. First, you've got the fact that he used to play with his back to his fans, and God help anyone who was brazen enough to approach him. There was also his vanity, which was so pronounced that he condemned music critics for singing the praises of anyone else, claiming that they were just out to take away his spotlight. Then there was his heroin and cocaine addictions, stories of pimping, and his abusive relationships with the women he married. Ex-wife Frances Davis has claimed that she wasn't just terrified of him, she actually ran away on multiple occasions, convinced he was going to kill her. Miles Davis even admitted to attacking his wives in his autobiography, and also proudly expressed his approval of other men hitting their wives and girlfriends, too. Richard Wagner died in 1883, decades before the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. That means he wasn't around to see his music heralded as the soundtrack of the rise of the modern anti-Semitism, but he probably wouldn't have hated this particular association. Wagner became more and more vocal about his anti-Semitic views as he grew older. He claimed that Jews couldn't produce art, instead only mimicking what they'd seen and heard from others. Even when he struggled as an up-and-coming composer, he blamed Jewish critics for keeping him from success. Wagner's anti-Semitic views were shared by his wife Cosima, originally a wife of one of the men in Wagner's entourage. They had married after their long-term affair resulted in a daughter. It's still debatable just how devoted to her he was, and he carried on with at least one mistress even while he was courting her. Brian Jones died when he was 27, and when Rolling Stone reported on the mysterious circumstances of his death, they subtitled their article, "Sympathy for the Devil." That's not just a clever play on one of the Rolling Stones' songs either.
He was two things. He was not very nice, and he upset people very easily. He wasn't very pleasant,
Jones's addiction to drugs famously led him to part ways with the rest of the band not long before his death by drowning in 1969. His trouble had started long before that, though, and he was even kicked out of grammar school for inciting a rebellion. He held down a ton of random jobs over the years, often fought with members of the press, and held an even more violent streak behind closed doors. Anita Pallenberg was one of the original muses for the Stones. She would eventually go on to have a long-term relationship with Keith Richards, but she started out with Jones. Their relationship was an abusive one, and it ended when Jones hit her so hard he broke his hand on her face. Sympathy for the devil, indeed. Nobody in the modern music industry is as capable of voicing controversial opinions quite so loudly as Morrissey. In 2007, he sat down for an interview with NME in which he lamented what he saw as the death of Britishness. While Morrissey denied being either xenophobic or racist, he was still quoted as saying, "Although I don't have anything against people from other countries, the price of immigration is enormous. Travel to England and you have no idea where you are." 3 years later, The Guardian ran an interview with Morrissey, a staunch vegetarian who went on record condemning the animal rights abuses going on in China. He then continued, "You can't help but feel that the Chinese are a subspecies." Then, when the Harvey Weinstein scandal broke, Morrissey had this to say, "I hate sexual situations that are forced on someone, but in many cases, one looks at the circumstances and thinks that the person who is considered a victim is merely disappointed." In fact, Morrissey has targeted so many people that Rolling Stone once published a roundup of all his most controversial opinions. The highlights include blaming Kate Middleton for the suicide of a nurse, shrugging off a massacre that left 77 people dead as nothing compared to what happens at McDonald's every day, and calling for Elton John's head to be served to him on a plate. In 2016, James Brown's daughter Yama released her memoir, Cold Sweat: My Father, James Brown, and Me. It is a heartbreaking cautionary tale of a girl who grew up in a family where domestic abuse was the norm, who ended up in an abusive marriage of her own.
You are traumatized by it, but it becomes your truth and your reality that maybe mom is there, she really loves him, maybe this is what love is all about.
Yama says that even though Brown never turned on her, she grew up terrified that he would. She described a number of incidents, including one of which she wrote, "Blood spurted from my mother's face. She started thrashing around, kicking her legs, holding up her arms to ward off the punches and trying to break free, trying to save herself." Many of these incidents became public knowledge. In 2004, Rolling Stone reported Brown was arrested for shoving then-wife Tommy Ray Brown and sending her to the hospital. Brown also fathered an indeterminate number of illegitimate and unacknowledged children. After his death, forgotten sons and daughters began coming forward with DNA proof that they were Brown's kids. Brown even found himself at the heart of a change in legislature. In 2005, Jacques Hollander came forward and accused Brown of a 1998 rape, but the case was refused because of the time that had elapsed since the attack. The law was subsequently changed to give victims more time to report a crime, a result that Hollander was happy with. When Aerosmith frontman Steven Tyler wrote his 2011 memoir, Does the Noise in My Head Bother You?, he wrote a little about his early girlfriend, Julia Holcomb. Tyler claimed he had nicknamed her Little Bo Peep and said that they liked to have sex in public, but he left out a lot of other details. Holcomb wanted to clear the air about what she says really happened in their relationship, so she took to LifeSite to tell her side of the story. According to her, she was a 16-year-old from a broken family when she met Tyler, and their relationship only formally began when her troubled mother signed documents making Tyler her legal guardian. Holcomb said she was already pregnant by the time he asked her to marry him, and plans for a family started to fall apart when his grandmother refused to pass on her ring. 5 months into the pregnancy, Holcomb was trapped in a house fire and sent to the hospital, where she says Tyler convinced her to have an abortion. Holcomb then left Tyler as he had already moved on to other women. She returned to her parents, and Tyler returned to the rock star life. Alexander Scriabin was a Russian composer who was born on Christmas Day. He eventually came to see that as just one more piece of evidence that he was, in fact, the Messiah. Scriabin was brilliant, but troubled. For example, his hands were too small for him to play certain piano pieces, so he practiced until they broke, and kept practicing until the bones stretched enough that he could reach the keys. After he became interested in religious philosophy and the occult, Scriabin grew more and more convinced he was destined to change the world, mostly by bringing about the end times. He started writing a huge composition called the Mysterium, which he envisioned as a work of music, dance, choreographed performances, and incense, and more than a few bells, too. The goal was to stage the entire 7-day performance in the Himalayan mountains, then kick open the door to the end of days and wipe out humanity. Sadly, Scriabin's plans were thwarted when he cut himself shaving and died of an infection. Spade Cooley was born in 1910, so you'd be forgiven for not really knowing who he is. He was huge in the 1950s, though, having once declared that he was the king of Western swing, led a 30-piece band, hosted his own TV show, and made appearances in more than 50 movies. He's even got a star on Hollywood Boulevard. Of course, you might have known the name Spade Cooley better if his career hadn't been derailed by alcohol, pills, jealousy, and murder. In the 1950s, Cooley filed for divorce from his then second wife, Ella May. They were on the verge of getting back together when he murdered her on April 3, 1961. The killing of Ella May wasn't merely too gruesome to describe either. He also committed it directly in front of their 14-year-old daughter, Melody. Cooley reportedly put a cigarette out on Ella May to make sure she was dead, then sat around in bloody clothes for a few hours before finally calling someone for help. Melody's testimony ultimately led to Cooley's conviction, and he was up for parole in 1970. However, in 1969, he was granted permission to perform at a charity concert. Cooley collapsed and died backstage. To this day, he remains the only celebrity to hold both a Walk of Fame star and a murder conviction. Chetham's School of Music is a prestigious school in Manchester, England, and until 1994, the director of music there was Michael Brewer. An acclaimed singer and chorister, Brewster was also the director of the National Youth Choir and was even awarded an OBE for his services to music. In 2013, however, he was imprisoned for sexual abuse. It began for Frances Andrade when she was just 14 years old. Brewer was her teacher and repeatedly assaulted her between 1978 and 1982. Brewer's then-wife Hillary was also involved in the assault and was arrested, charged, and convicted separately. None of this came to light until years later, and when it did, law enforcement stumbled into other complaints that had been covered up, including an affair with a 17-year-old student. Andrade testified during a trial at Manchester Crown Court, but several of the charges against Brewer and his ex-wife were dropped mid-trial. Only 6 days after hearing that news, Andrade died by suicide. Her son reportedly blamed not only Brewer, but his defense counsel too, for taking the route of calling his mother a liar and a fantasist during their trial.
She tried so hard to keep a straight face in front of the jury, to try to seem strong for them, but it was extremely hard on her.
In terms of musical significance, no one has had such an impact on R&B as R. Kelly. Unfortunately, R. Kelly is also a man who has reportedly committed a number of crimes and abuses against women and young girls. For 25 years now, Kelly has been well known for abusing and harassing women and grooming teenage girls. These reports have been so unrelenting, in fact, that Lifetime was able to dedicate 6 whole hours for its harrowing documentary series, Surviving R. Kelly. Perhaps one of the worst accusations is that Kelly held a number of teenage girls, some as young as 14, in a demented sex cult, groomed them, and abused them. Following the broadcast of Surviving R. Kelly, Chicago and Atlanta prosecutors opened new investigations into the singer. And in 2021, he was tried and convicted on 9 counts, including kidnapping, racketeering, and sex trafficking. There's an old anecdote about British musician Ian Dury's drunken antics that basically sums up everything about him. Disabled in one arm and one leg by a childhood battle with polio, the alcoholic Dury nonetheless liked to get drunk and insult the biggest and nastiest guy in any given pub, just to see if they would try and fight a disabled person. Sometimes they would, and Dury's bandmates would step in and finish the fight for him. Since it often ended in beating for the band members, sticking up for drunken Dury became known as Dury Duty. Dury's acid tongue wounded more than just random bruisers in various London pubs, however. According to his son Baxter, Dury was like a Polaris missile, able to lock onto anyone's weakness in seconds and verbally destroy them. This form of violence was dished out basically whenever he had been drinking. He would target his family, friends, children, or whoever happened to wander into sight. Dury's relationship with Baxter, who is now a musician himself, was incredibly troubling. For example, he once left his teenage son in the care of a violent drug dealer known as the Sulfate Strangler for 3 whole years. Not exactly Father of the Year material. One of John Lennon's most famous songs asked its listener to imagine all the people living life in peace. Before trying to fix the world's problems, however, the ex-Beatle might have wanted to fix those occurring in his own home. Despite his hippie image, Lennon left a string of broken people in his wake. He abandoned his first son, Julian, when the boy was only 5. As Julian himself has said, Lennon then basically blocked his son from his mind, giving Julian's mom, Cynthia, just enough money for school and clothes and not a penny more.
I lived with Mum, and we lived a totally isolated life from the world of what was going on with the Beatles.
Moreover, while he was still with Cynthia, Lennon would verbally abuse the young Julian over the slightest things and leave piles of drugs lying around the house. He also had a string of affairs, a practice he carried over to his marriage with Yoko Ono, although Ono doesn't seem to have minded. Perhaps worst of all, though, was Lennon's admission in a 1980 Playboy interview that he used to hit the women in his life. Before he became famous as Tina Turner's husband, Ike Turner was known for being one of a handful of people who could claim to have invented rock and roll. After he married Tina, Ike became more well known for being one of the most abusive husbands in showbiz. Tina once wrote that their lives together were defined by abuse and fear. To begin with, Ike took Tina to a brothel on their wedding night. He routinely did cocaine and then had sex with her in such a brutal way that Tina admitted it felt more like assault. He sometimes beat her, at various times breaking her nose and jaw, and gave her 2 black eyes and leaving her with 3rd-degree burns after hurling hot coffee in her face. At one moment in her autobiography, I, Tina, the star writes with shocking frankness about tasting blood from a beating as she sang on stage. There are also rumors that Ike threatened to kill Tina, shot bullets into her house after they split up, and once drove her to attempt suicide. When asked about it in a Spin magazine magazine interview, Ike said, "I didn't hit her any more than the average guy beats his wife." In the post-Me Too era, it has become quite clear how far the rich and powerful will frequently go to silence their accusers. That may be why, despite an all-out assault by the Jackson estate calling its subjects' credibility into account, the documentary Leaving Neverland has actually made it to TV. This 4-hour film features detailed interviews with two men who say they survived persistent abuse at the hands of Michael Jackson as children. Leaving Neverland slowly builds an effective, methodical case with so many damning details that many have found its accusations difficult to question. Not that others haven't tried, though. The two accusers, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, had previously defended Jackson at his trial, and later lost a civil suit against the estate for abuse allegations. Jackson's estate says this shows their story is motivated by greed. Robson and Safechuck now credibly allege that Jackson groomed them as children, molested them, forced them to perform sex acts on him, and even staged a mock wedding. All the while, Jackson threatened them with prison if they ever told a soul.